All right, so now we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, propaganda. Well, did you know that propaganda can actually be true, or at least partially true? But more often than that, it's a mixture of all kinds of claims all pushed together. Really, one of the most core elements of propaganda that makes it propaganda is the fact that it's trying to further an agenda. So here, let's start with this definition by Professor Nicole Cooke, who is from the American Library Association, and she's actually a professor of information studies and library studies. Here's how she defines propaganda. Propaganda is information that is subjective and is used primarily to influence the target audience and further an agenda, often by presenting facts selectively, perhaps lying by omission, or by using coded or suggestive messages or language to elicit an emotional response as opposed to a rational response. And that's really important to think about, how it's largely based on manipulating people's emotions for a specific purpose. You'll probably notice a lot of propaganda on actually news stations and on social media. Sometimes it's on the news that's, strongly favoring one side or the other. You might think it's a news program, but actually it's just an opinion program where people are just spouting off their opinions about things. And actually, when they're targeting it that way, it becomes a type of propaganda, actually. And one of the main propaganda techniques that even the Soviet Union recommended was just the idea of repetition. This is something that's all over social media, just certain themes, certain phrases, certain images that are put together. And then they might not even be true, or they only show a small part of the story. And when they get repeated over and over and over again, they get kind of ingrained in people's minds. And often on social media, people even know that something is false. But because they think it's funny, they just keep looking at these kinds of things and they pass it on to friends. But I want you to think about how that affects you. Like, if this kind of joke isn't even true and you just keep consuming that over and over again and you just keep passing it along, it becomes a little bit hard for you to really think about this issue rationally and to try to get to the facts and the truth about this matter. So often propaganda is in the form of jokes and then just repeated ideas, and then it just gets kind of embedded in your consciousness, and then you're just going to end up following the whims and desires of that particular group of powerful people who had the resources to actually promote those ideas and that narrative. And then you might not consider the other side objectively and to think about what would be the best solution. So here are some tips for actually identifying propaganda when you're either on social media or watching an opinion show on TV or even just talking to other people. I decided to kind of pull apart and dissect Cooke's definition. So her first point in her definition was that propaganda is information that is subjective. In other words, that means, does it provide only one perspective in a debate, or are the opinions on moral issues or predictions about the future presented as facts? Almost anything in the future, it's basically an argument or an opinion. And then moral issues as well, that it's different from actually like a hard fact. You just have to be aware that that's what it is. It's promoting one side or the other, and that it's likely to leave out most of the big picture. All right, so the next point is propaganda is used primarily to influence the target audience and further an agenda. So I want you to ask yourself, can you recognize the intent to help one side and hurt the other side? Even in a source that's supposed to be a news article, you could just tell by the way they're organizing it. They first give one side and then the other side, and you can see it set up actually as a rebuttal to kind of show that they're definitely taking sides and trying to make one side look better than the other. Maybe the pictures make the other side look bad, for example. Okay, and then here's a third point here. Propaganda often presents facts selectively, perhaps lying by omission. And it's almost impossible to actually cover all the facts in one single article or one news clip. So they're inherently selective about what they choose just because of time. But then you can definitely see that even if the material might be factual, you want to ask yourself, well, what's missing? That's why you have to look at multiple sources. And then also, do some of the claims seem to be inaccurate or outright lies? So those can get through into a news article. Typically, the journalist doesn't write the lies themselves, but they may quote someone who is lying, and they might just put that in there, and if you read it quickly and it comes from someone that you think is a trusted source, trusted politician, you might just believe it, even though it's a lie. And even if the news journalists are supposed to usually kind of give some context about where did that come from, but you might be deceived by something, then it's a quote in a news source. All right, so here's another point. Propaganda often uses coded or suggestive messages or language to elicit an emotional response as opposed to a rational response. So, in this part of her definition, Nicole Cooke is asking us to think about how actually our inner emotions are being affected by what we're looking at. So, as I said, we talked about jokes earlier, how the jokes, they kind of just have an impact on you. You think something's funny, you think you get angry at the other side and think it's ridiculous what the other side's doing. You just want to think about, how do you feel about it? Is it evoking anger or deep sadness, things like this, these strong emotion or strong moral feelings in you? And you have to kind of be cautious about that, because they can manipulate those emotions, patterns and visuals, language, things you can do with tone of voice and music that can just really overwhelm your senses and push you to think a certain way. All right, so think that propaganda definitely, it hides in reposts on social media, or maybe a forwarded link, forwarded email by friends, family, and celebrities. What I mean by reposts is that the idea might have actually originated from even a hostile foreign government. There are definitely countries out there that do view the United States as an enemy. But also some of this propaganda, a lot of it even just comes right from here, our own domestic politicians. Some of the propaganda even comes from advertisers or corporations. It can sometimes come even from smaller groups that then somehow their ideas catch on and are spread. So they come from all different sources. Okay, so here's the next place where I think propaganda hides pretty well, pretty effectively, and it's actually through interviews in the news with experts. So experts can still want to promote an agenda, and they may have some relevant education, but if you really look at what they're saying, it's just wrong, or really only pushing an agenda in a very emotional way. If there's just so many lies in the interview, the news journalists just can't keep up with fact checking. Sometimes they do fact check pretty well, and then sometimes they don't, and then you just have to really pay attention. Or maybe they only fact check certain things and they don't fact check others. Also, think about why the news organization or whatever YouTube channel, why are they asking this person to talk about that topic? Why couldn't they have chosen someone else who maybe has a different perspective or a different agenda? Kind of related to that is you have to look at journalists' treatment of the interviewees. So as I said, there may be motives for letting an interviewee lie on air without correcting them. So journalists might not want to seem rude on air because they want the interviewees to come back again, because that's what they're selling. They're selling information. And if this famous person doesn't want to come back after being fact-checked, the journalists lose their appeal to the public. All right, so here's another emotional side of propaganda. I've always noticed that different sources seem very conscious about the facial expressions of different people in photos. You can see that they might put a nice picture of that person. They might have that person with a grimace, or they might have an angry expression on their face. And I think that's done very intentionally. All right, next I want to talk about the headlines. So the headlines for news articles and videos are really interesting to compare. That you could take on a particular day, you could just compare the headlines on the home pages or on the news pages of different sources and just see what kind of tone they are. So one side will probably try to make it use more positive language in the headline, and another might use a little more scary language or a little negative language, and that definitely indicates a bias in how they're covering it. And sometimes even when a news story is very new, you might even just see factual mistakes in the headlines. I've seen that where some fine detail is different from one source to the other, and then that's kind of a concern. You just have to wait another day or two until the details get clarified, and then everyone's going to have to correct what they previously said. But by then it's almost too late, because a lot of people already would have seen the article that was somewhat inaccurate because it was premature or it was just very biased. Then you want to look at the tone of the rest of the article and see, does the whole article or video use a similar tone? And that can confirm what you were thinking. Even fact checkers themselves can be biased, so I've provided a link here called a fact check bias chart. So even these days, you can't just look at one fact checker. You might want to look at one fact checker from one side of the aisle and then a fact checker from the other side of the aisle. But the idea of a fact checker is to criticize the propaganda and the emotional appeals that are out there, and just get to the facts and dig into the details about what actually happened. All right, so here's some final tips. If you see someone promoting something as just so good or so great and kind of leaving it at that and just having a lot of emotional appeals about how awesome something is, that might be propaganda. Or if someone is just so strongly saying that something is so awful, it's horrible, it's evil, that probably is propaganda too. So those are the kinds of things you should filter if something is portrayed as extremely positive or extremely negative. All right, so I know that fact-finding, fact-checking, evaluating information, and looking at media bias and propaganda, it's a pretty intimidating topic. And it can even be pretty discouraging to see how much disinformation and propaganda hurts people around the world. But if you care about this issue, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are part of a growing community of people across the globe who want to make the world a better place by getting to the heart of issues, by focusing on facts and logic. And even if the world is falling apart around you, there is honor and integrity in being the kind of person who actively seeks a factual, objective analysis of any issue. So just keep building up your fact-checking and analysis skills, stay well informed, and connect with other people who do the same. We got your back.